Well, thanks for coming on the coldest day of the year. There's a few seats up in the front here, so you don't have to stand. So come on up. And I want to acknowledge some help that I've had in producing this paper by Brad Pino and Jen Beverly and Barb Thomas and Charles Knock. And I'd like to acknowledge that they produced all the good ideas, and if there's any bad ones, they're mine. Okay? So let's look at this topic of sustainability, and it's a tough topic to try to cover in an hour. It's because it's so complex. But what I want to do is I'm going to talk about some principles of sustainability first, and the current forest management policy. You could spend months studying this, but I'm going to give you a high-level overview of a few points that I think are really important. Is forest management policy delivering sustainability? That's probably the question you really would like to know. And then we're going to talk about forest disturbances and forest carbon a bit. And again, I apologize for the trivial way that some of these topics are going to be covered. Let's deal with the first topic, wilderness. These are some principles that people hold dear to their heart. An area undisturbed by human activities, where natural processes and communities develop. Okay, that's really what it is. And a lot of environmental groups hold this very dear to their heart, and with good reason, because sustainability and a lot of this is related to disturbances, particularly eroding in the landscape. There's another concept that's very different and almost completely diametrically opposed to the concept of wilderness, is deforestation, the permanent clearing of forests to make way for new non-forest land uses. So they're very different, they're two ends of the spectrum. Okay, let's look at some wilderness first. Usually we think of wilderness as diverse places with big trees. And that would be an example. Here's an example of a forest that many would say is a wilderness forest. Okay? And you have people who hold that concept very dearly to their heart, this concept of wilderness. Threats to the boreal forest, and the David Suzuki Foundation compares logging to mining and makes statements like it's without limits. And those are pretty powerful statements that I'd like to take issue with, and I think you'll see that they're probably a little bit pushing the envelope pretty far out there. Or the Natural Resources Defense Council looking at cutting of forests as being really a negative thing, completely negative thing. Okay? On the other side of the coin, we've got deforestation, where deforestation would be losing the forest. And in this case, we've got deforestation that's associated with agriculture. And agriculture is going rampant in places like in the tropical areas of the world, where you've got deforestation going on in southern Brazil, where they build a road in and then they start to eat away at the forest and convert it into agricultural land. And that is a genuine deforestation. We did that ourselves very effectively in northern Alberta. If you'd have looked at the Peace River Valley in 1950, it would have looked like that. And so we did this very, very well ourselves. So we can't be completely feeling really good about ourselves when we see this going on in Brazil now. Let's look at deforestation though right now. And deforestation in Canada is not as high, not that conversion of the land. 34,000 hectares of land roughly per year is being deforested in Canada. And a large percentage of that is going to agriculture still. It's still not very much. It was way down compared to what it used to be. But that's still where most of the deforestation is going on. There's some in oil and gas. Forestry actually doesn't have much official deforestation going on because of the road reclamation in the interior of the forest cut blocks is pretty effective generally. at least by the definitions and by the statistics. Okay, now I wanted to talk about forest management planning. And if you look at forest management planning, it's a process where we map areas and we determine what is going to happen in those areas. And it's usually with GIS processes where we look at maps and try to figure out exactly what's going on. It's usually coupled with forest management agreement areas where the province has allocated blocks of land for forest management. The idea here is those blocks of land are going to be for timber production. That was the principle that was developed in 1950. 54, in fact, I think was the first year that our first forest management agreement area was developed. And we made the commitment that we were going to manage the land for timber in that year. And subsequent to that, there were a whole bunch of new forest management agreement areas added. I'm going to show you a picture of this one right here. That's the Weyerhaeuser Forest Management Agreement area, south of Grand Prairie. And you can look at that, a chunk of that land. And if you looked at that piece of land, you would see oil and gas roads, well pads. You would see a lot of evidence of cutting, and you'd also see a lot of evidence of reforestation. So the forest is being reforested, but it is no longer wilderness because it's got roads and it's got all these disturbances, these artificial disturbances, these human-caused disturbances on the land. So we are not deforesting, but it's not wilderness. And that's pretty typical. You can go to Google Maps, you can find this just about anywhere in the province. If you start to look, you'll see this kind of landscape, okay? So that's what's going on. And coupled with that, there is this concept of sustained yield. This is a long-held policy that was developed 150 years ago in Germany and Austria, and it's been a long-held policy that's been spread throughout the world. Continuous production of wood for each year planned for more than a century, a long time in the future. You're going to plan this so that you're never going to run out of wood. Good idea for towns and communities to keep them with employment and all kinds of things like that. So it's a concept of sustainability that was developed a long, long time ago. And we've adopted it pretty vigorously in Western Canada. It still forms the basis for how we manage our forests. The principle here is regenerate, grow, tend, harvest, and then regenerate again. The circle is complete. Okay? And it also allows us to produce an annual amount of cut each year. So the principles here are pretty simple. If you've got a perfect sustained yield forest, a normal forest, a fully regulated forest, you've got this idealistic, almost completely never happens kind of forest, where you've got uniform age classes uniform sizes of forest in each age class, and you're growing them just like a German railway system. You know exactly how fast it's going to happen, and they're moving along in a very steady way and moving towards maturity, and then they can be cut, and then bingo, you move it back and you start over again and regenerate. Okay? That's the principle of sustained yield. We're still using this basic concept in our forest management planning. And it forms the basis of our timber supply. It also requires, and we are committed to this, you can see these numbers here, 2 billion trees have been planted in the last 20 years in Alberta to feed the sustained yield process. And it works fairly effectively in the sense that the planting is real. They are regenerating the forest. These trees, from my experience, most of them are alive and growing. So we can't argue with the effort that's being put into this process. So the process is happening. So in 14 years, that's the way some of these stands look. You know, just a vigorous spruce plantation in that case. So if you look at Canada-wide, what's going on in the sustained yield in this process? State of Canada's forests, and that's a large amount of good information comes out of that document. It's readily available on the web. We planted 600 million trees in 2016. And if you look at that, and if you took in 10 years, you'd have 6 million trees planted in 10 years. So there's a number that I'm going to use that. Remember that number, you're going to hear it later. So this is being planted on provincially managed forest lands. Okay? So 600 million trees are planted per year, roughly, in that case. Similarly, Alberta and other provinces have very strict rules about what actually happens on the forest, how the forests are regenerated. And they're not simple. You can spend a lot of time puzzling through this 376 pages of these documents, trying to figure out exactly how the forest should be regenerated. And so when the David Suzuki Foundation puts this statement, without limits, I just got kind of puzzled by that. Have they ever looked at what actually has to happen? With the Alberta Forest Management Planning Standards, 114 pages, and it's a very detailed document describing how forest management planning is done. So there's an incredible amount of energy and policy and rules and regulations that have to be followed. Now we're going to come up to this eventually and ask, do they work? That's further in the lecture. But they're there. And there's a lot of energy goes into this. A lot of money is spent trying to achieve these standards. Okay? And here's essentially what they're doing. If you look at timber supply, it's being fed by replanting, by vegetation competition, and somewhat, a little bit, by forest genetics. That's the things that's feeding the timber supply. The projection of the timber supply. Okay? I'll come back to this later. Okay, so if you look at a regulated forest, we've got some examples of these regulated forests in Alberta that are coming up and they're doing pretty well, really. They look like the German model in terms of the regulation. If you look at that landscape, you can see chunks of forest of different age classes represented on that landscape. And it's regulated. It's pretty close to being fully regulated. This is south of Hinton. If you ever want to go there and have a look, there it is. And all age classes are represented, and it's regulated, or close to it. Okay. In the last 40 years, and the most recent version of that is this example here. We're trying to produce more things than just wood in the forest, and we're trying to manage the forest for more than just wood production. Okay, so that means society is really starting to put itself forward in terms of what should actually happen in that forest. And the big thing is social license to operate. There has been some concerns that forest management has not been the best thing for the forest in general in the last 20 years particularly. Okay? So the federal and provincial forest ministers all got together about 20 years ago and worked on a task to produce the criteria and indicators of sustainable forest management. And you can find this document on the web. It's easily searchable. And it really looks at what are some of the indicators that we should be looking for to make sure that the forests are managed sustainably for not just wood, but other values as well. Okay? So here are some of these other values. Biodiversity, ecosystem condition and productivity, and that's where sustained yield is buried into that one, in that number 2. And it's still there. It's still probably the dominant feature of forest management planning. But there's still making sure that soil and water is conserved. The forest is playing a role in global ecological cycles, and economic and social benefits of forest management are still sustained. Towns are still got employment, and taxes are being paid, and social services are being held in place. The society's responsibilities, and that's where you think things like for having a consistent forest policy and Indigenous consultation and informed decision making, all these sorts of things are put into the picture. So that's all part of sustainability as well. Okay? And the forest management plans use this as their criteria that they try to live by. Number 2 is still a dominant feature though, and you can't ignore that. Okay, so some of the things that have changed in the last 20 years. We see leaving stand structure and residual trees after logging. Boreal and coastal BC, it's more like a forest that would be emulating what would happen after a natural disturbance. So we have this kind of policy that we have in place. So larger areas, more like big fires or windstorms or other things like that. That's the way the forest is trying to look after cutting. There is some considerable increase in activities in terms of indigenous forestry and indigenous populations, making sure their sacred sites and hunting and food plants are still there, and trapping and edible berries and medicines and all kinds of things like that. They're still in place. You might argue it's not good enough, but there is an increased attempt at that. Okay? Now there's also a new thing that's going on. It's actually it's about 20 years old as well, or close to 20 years old, where you're looking at forest certification. And here we're dealing with third-party certification. Society is really distrustful, went through a period of extreme distrust of provincial policies and what the forest companies were doing on the land. So they felt that they needed a third party to evaluate whether or not forestry was actually being done sustainably. So they developed these third-party groups. They're going above and beyond, in some cases above and beyond what the provincial regulators' requirements are. Okay? They're going above and beyond it. One of the things that is being done that it wasn't in it before was chain of custody of wood products. So you keep track of where the wood came from through the whole process, which forest it came from, was that a sustainably managed forest, all the way to selling it in Home Depot or Lowe's. And that was added in the chain of custody. Okay. So here are the three that are dominant. The Forest Stewardship Council, and if you look at Canada, we got about 50 million hectares of that. Canadian Standards Association, the same group that certifies your toaster to see whether or not it's safe. Well, they actually do the same thing for forest management, and they use a bunch of criteria and indicators of sustainability, just like, and we use that. There's an American one, like a Sustainable Forestry Initiative, that is applied to quite a number of the areas in Canada. So if you look at a map of forest certification in Canada, there's a lot of land that's been sustainably certified as sustainably managed. So right across the country, we have a large percentage of our managed forest lands are in this category. Far more than any other country in the world. Okay? And if you looked at, let's go back to that concept of sustained yield. If you look at the softwood timber supply, and that's based upon the calculations from the forest management plans, how much wood is actually available versus the softwood harvest, the dash line versus the actual harvest. In all cases, whether it's hardwood or total wood supply, in all cases, there's more wood available than is actually being harvested. That's the message, according to the timber supply analysis. Okay, and that's Canada-wide. That doesn't mean that there aren't local places where they might be over-harvesting, somewhat. But Canada-wide, we got more wood than we're actually harvesting. That's what the timber supply says. Okay, feel pretty good about this whole business right now. You'd say, yeah, we got it all beat. There's no problems. There's no problems, and that's kind of the story you would like to hear, right? But then you got this. You got this. The whole BC forest industry is shrinking. That was a headline from last summer. And it's coming from, the mills are shutting down. They're running out of wood. Okay, if we had this perfect forest management, that shouldn't happen, should it? So what is going on? Well, probably the root cause is this. It's climate change. Warmer summers and winters. Precipitation is uncertain, but if temperature goes up, we're probably going to have more droughts and more decrease in water supply and more drought. And if you look at some of the predictions, and this is just one of them, there's about five of these that I could have selected from, but none of them predict good things for Alberta in terms of the forest in the future. And it's probably already going on, where you've got a biome shift, and essentially the forest land is becoming drier and less likely to support good trees in the future, according to the weather and the predicted weather that we would likely, and climate that we would likely have. I should be using the word climate instead. The predicted climate that we would have in the future. Okay? So, I took these pictures about 15 years ago during one of the worst droughts we've ever had, the worst drought we had in Western Canada in 2002, and we lost quite a few mature trees during that drought, and we are likely to get more of these kinds of things in the future. Large fires, and loss of mature forest and immature forest from fires. They don't discriminate very well. You can have complete disarray. Those forest management plans that are being put out there, just completely destroyed. You can just toss them in the trash can after one of the fire events like you would have in High Level this summer. You'd have to start over in terms of forest management planning. Or if you have a large amount of beetle insect attack, start over. And we've had a large amount of that in the last 20 years. particularly BC has had, between the beetle and some of the big fires that they had in 17 and 18, large amount of the land, or forest land, has been lost. So instead of having a normal forest, a fully regulated forest that's got this beautiful flat distribution, you got forests that probably look like that. And that's the way a large many of these areas will look after the beetles and the fires get through with them. 10 or 15 years later, they're going to look like that. Got a whole bunch of young forests with relatively little older material that's available for logging and wood supply in the future, or old growth or other values in the future. You could put it that way too. You don't have to just focus on wood supply. Okay, so that's the scenario that BC is encountering, and we're probably getting there ourselves as well in Alberta. We're moving in that direction as well. So this is what forest management planning is really looking like. So if you had the timber supply, you could substitute old growth if you wanted to think about older forests, old growth, older forests. You can put that in there as well. So we're doing a lot of replanting, we're doing a lot of vegetation competition, we're looking at genetics in terms of growth, and Barb would argue we're going to start looking at it for other values, but we're not doing a particularly good job at dealing with these other issues. The fire, insects, diseases, invasive species, drought, wind throw. We're simply not addressing those in our forest management plans in an effective way. And there are some simple fixes that I can think of immediately. Anybody who thought about it for about 10 minutes would think of these. So I'm not going to project myself as being a genius with these two statements. But the first one is just planting more mixed species stands, and that would deal with more of reduce the risk of diseases and insects. Okay, if you had mixtures of species, you can't kill all the trees at once. Okay, anybody would think of that. The other one is try to control and manage the fuel supply, the flammability of the forest across the landscape, and do this spatially. Okay, those are two simple answers for trying to do this, but we're not doing either of those particularly effectively, in my opinion, and we should be. That would be so easy to do. The other things are more complicated, and we've got lots of smart people around that could help if we fully engaged ourselves in the management of the forest to look at these other problems. We probably likely could reduce the risk of the forest for these other events as well, if we fully engaged the community and allowed it to happen. And the reason why it's not happened so far is because the forest management planning is so rigid. The regeneration systems are so rigid that if somebody's got a good idea and they want to do something that's different, it's often blocked. That's my observation. So blocking of the forest management plans for trying to address some innovative ideas is not happening well. Okay. Trees can be used to store carbon. I don't think just anybody in the room would argue with that. Yeah, no question, they can. We can store carbon in the forests. It's possible to do that. And there's been a commitment to plant 2 billion trees in 10 years to try to reduce greenhouse gases. Okay, my calculation is 1,000 trees per hectare. That's about 2 million hectares of land that's sitting there waiting for somebody to plant trees on it. So it'd be hard to find it, actually. It would be tough to find that 2 million hectares. I think we could do it, but we'd have to look pretty hard to figure out exactly where it would be rational to do that, where it would be rational to put those 2 million trees. Because the forests that are being managed for wood production across Canada on these forest management agreement areas is already reforested. You know, so it wouldn't go there. So it's going to be somewhere else. So where is it? Don't really know. Could be some urban areas and other places like that. We really need to do this though. Anytime anybody starts talking about carbon and they don't do this, they don't do a life cycle analysis, I don't take them seriously. I don't think they really know that they don't really have any kind of idea of what they're actually doing without at least attempting a life cycle analysis of where that carbon is being stored and where it's going to end up. Okay, so we're going to plant those 2 billion trees, or the governments are planting trees, industry's planting trees. Got years of growth, and there's a long time. Reaches maturity, and then what happens? Those trees could die. If they regenerate naturally, then perhaps there's an outcome that is sustainable, at least holding the same relative amount of carbon in that forest. Okay, you could siphon off some of that carbon and put it into wood products, into solid wood products. And actually, solid wood products are a really good place for investing tree carbon into, because they're going to have a long lifetime in use, and better yet, the most important thing is they substitute for steel and concrete in many circumstances. That's really the big thing, because those two products take a lot of energy to produce, a lot of carbon to produce. Okay? So if the tree dies, currently what we do most of the time with urban trees is just chip them up and throw them in the flower bed. That seems to be the outcome of most of the carbon in urban trees. So that's not a very long-term solution for carbon storage. We need to. Are you going to replant them, put them back right to and replant it? We don't know any of this stuff. So I want to see this. I want to see the life cycle, what's actually going to happen with these trees in terms of whether or not that's a sustainable future. Another graph that you should know about comes from the state of Canada's forests again. There's a great group in Victoria that has produced an analysis of the carbon in the forests of Canada. And these are in the managed forests of Canada. Okay? What they're showing, if you look at this solid line here, that's the carbon emissions, whether or not they're going into the carbon is going into the forest. If it's below this zero line, that means the forest is pulling carbon into the forest. If it's above that zero line, there's carbon going out of the forest. So if you look from 2002 to 16, and I'm almost certain it was the same in 17 and 18 for sure, and probably 19 given the fires that we had, we're emitting more carbon from our forests than we are fixing. So not a very happy place that we're in. The reason why that carbon emission, these green areas or the area that's managed in forest activities, the red is the burned areas, and we have this light green is the area disturbed by insects. So in that circumstance, we're seeing that mountain pine beetle played a big role, but the big fires are probably the ones that really spike up the carbon emissions in any given year. So in 2015, there was a big fire year. Over 2 million hectares of land was burned in Canada, and lots of the carbon was emitted into the atmosphere. And we had 17, 18, lots of big fires. And 19 was, we had almost 1 million hectares of land burned in Alberta alone in 19. So it's not a great place we're in terms of sustainability of the forest because of these insects and fire. So we have to do something about this, or kind of give up on forest. It's an irony, in the sense that there's probably never been a time in the last 40 years when wood products were viewed so positively as a green product. Okay? We really like wood products suddenly. We like them for urban housing. We like them for mass timbers and composite lumber. Things like high-rise buildings. We're talking about building them out of wood. We've got paper pens. You can get one in the back if you want. Food wraps and bioplastic. All these sorts of things that are very positively associated with, that are coming from forests. But it's at the same time where we're less likely to be able to produce them with our current management systems. So it's kind of a bad time. I think we can do better in our forest management systems to offset some of these problems that are coming. But it's going to require a whole pile of new innovation and people thinking outside the box, not getting stuck in a forest management planning system that's 150 years old. And that's where the dominant thing we're doing right now is. That's pretty well where we're at. So I'm going to stop early. I could talk a lot longer on a whole bunch of those topics, and so maybe you have some questions. If you took that climate map, that biome map that I showed, that suggests that we are going to have a lot of stress on the trees that are already there, the existing species. So if we could find new species and new genotypes that would grow in those places, you'd have to do it carefully so that they wouldn't escape and they wouldn't threaten other species, let's put it that way, or in a very negative way. But I think we're beyond the stage where we can say we can't have any of that because we don't like it in principle. We have to have a better reason than that, than I just don't like it. That's my feelings. And I know there's people in the audience who probably disagree with that, but that's my thinking, that we're beyond that stage. And we are rapidly getting to the point where we'll become desperate to be able to grow things. The efficiency of tree planting. Yeah. The efficiency of tree planting where there's vegetation control is actually pretty high. I'd say that in the circumstances with spruce, they have very low mortality rates. They're probably 75% of them are going to get fairly big. They're going to get as big as this ceiling, at least. And many of them will carry right on to rotation, to maturity. Pine, not so much. That species there's just so many things that like to chew on it and eat it. It's got a much higher rate of mortality. And so probably 30% of those trees that are planted might make it much longer. Yeah. How they produce such a large amount of emission?
What are they doing to create?
Well, it's the insects. You got a kilogram of insects of mountain pine beetle. They go around and chew a few kilograms of phloem, and so they emit a little bit of carbon while they're doing that. That's not where the carbon emission is coming from. They kill the tree. The tree then loses its leaves, starts dropping its foliage, drops its bark. The stem starts to decompose over a 10 or 15 year period, and then it's just more and more and more carbon goes up in the atmosphere. Yeah. Yeah. A middle ground in what sense? You see, the policy, we've lived with very conservative forest policy for a long time. And I know in the last decade, some people have wanted to make some changes, and they've been blocked by the forest management standards and the regeneration standards and the forest planning standards have blocked their changes. You're right, though, and so that means that we're not even adjusting as we're speaking right now. We're slow to adjust, and so you're right, though, in the sense that it's a long process. But if you don't start now, you're not going to get anywhere, and we probably will have to the fire. The fire issues, and as well as the insect issues, are probably the biggest concerns. They certainly have been, but we're likely going to get diseases as well, and we're likely going to get exotic species, exotic insects and diseases coming in that are going to cause even more problems. And so this is going to require a lot of good thinking by a whole bunch of people. For instance, with insects, we need to have more research on insects and how to manage these insect populations in a better way than we are currently now doing, which is really a very crude system of search and destroy in the case of mountain pine beetle. It works, but by God, it's expensive. And it's not a long-term solution. Search and destroy, search for new outbreaks and destroy them. Yes? Well, a lot of the mountain pine beetle has been salvaged. The areas that have been killed by mountain pine beetle have been salvaged, and that would reduce the fuel loads. But not all of them. And how do you manage that? How do you manage it? You could do prescribed burns where you would reduce the risk that it's going to spread into, but by burning some of that material in controlled conditions and safer conditions, you would prevent a catastrophic fire in the future and in different times. Yeah.
When you say that the pine beetle forests have been reclaimed or reused, what do you mean by that?
Well, they've been cut. They've been cut, and anytime in the current policy is that anytime there's cutting, there's also a requirement for restoration and replanting of that forest, redevelopment of a forest after cutting.
Is there any, what happens to that lumber? Is it just tossed or burned, or how do they?
No, it's used as lumber.
Oh, okay.
It's used as lumber. They can use it for a number of years until it becomes too cracked, and there's too many cracks in the wood that the value of the log is reduced to the point where it's not worth trying to mill it anymore. And that can go on for between, I've heard values anywhere from up to 10 years, all the way up to 10 years, but sometimes they stop quite a bit earlier than that. Well, if you like, in the last decade, the fires are bigger, and if you could follow that policy. You could follow that policy with the idea that you're going to accept a young forest, and you're not going to have much opportunity to have older timber and old growth forest, because the old growth will burn up too. So if you follow that, that's what you'll get. Okay, good question. When a natural disturbance goes through a forest, who's responsible for planting? A natural disturbance may not, from my understanding, the way it works is this. There is no management. If there's nobody cuts it, there is no management on that forest, and it would regenerate naturally. And they would wait until there was evidence that there is a forest back on the site before they would actually put it into their timber supply models in the future. That's the way it would work. Is that your understanding?
There's also programs available through PRAIrie, so a portion of your timber use goes to the Forestry Resource Improvement Association, and you can apply for grants and information.
Yeah. It takes a lot of money to reforest a forest by artificial means. And so somebody's got to pay for it. And so if you have funding supplies, tax dollars, or you have to let nature do it. Oldest.
Can you give me some hope for the future?
Just gonna be true.
Yeah. Well, let's take this map here. Let's take this map. This area right here. That's an example. It's an Alpax FMA. There's 2 million hectares of land in that area, in Alpax FMA, that's been netted out because it's too wet. It's too wet to grow a forest right now. So I don't know what's going to happen with that land. Some large amount of it is on peatlands. But I suspect that area will become more important for forest management in the future, because it is the lower part of the landscape the water will collect. Anytime there is water, it's going to collect and run downhill. That's the way water seems to work. And it's going to be in those places where there likely will be forests still in the future. It may not be the same species, but I can't see why we can't grow forest in some of those locations. And I think we're going to find north-facing slopes and all kinds of places like that will still have forest lands. But there's going to probably still be many places that will be unsuitable for the species we have. Maybe we'll be growing ponderosa pine in those locations instead of white spruce. I don't know. That's why I keep saying we got to get creative people looking at this task, not just looking at it from the perspective of crude models and crude models like that. That's not going to answer the problem in the future. I think I better stop because I know some of you have got places to go. But if you want to talk some more, I'll stay. But I think we should let people leave.